When my son-in-law publicly mocked my retirement gift in French at my party, assuming I was too ignorant to understand his cruel insults, he had no idea who he was really dealing with. What happened next completely shocked everyone in that room and changed our family forever. My son-in-law just called me a worthless old fool in French at my retirement party, thinking I couldn't understand a word. I'm Harold Stevens, 67 years old, and I stood there in my work shirt and old boots while Roger Martinez told his fancy MBA friends that my gift was complete junk from some clueless garage mechanic. The vintage carburetor in my hands wasn't junk. It was a fully restored P-51 Mustang carburetor, authenticated by the Smithsonian and valued at $75,000. But Roger didn't know that. For the past 3 years, he'd believed I was just Harold the garage mechanic, not Harold Stevens, retired senior aerospace engineer from Boeing. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just smiled and said, "That's interesting, Roger." Then I decided it was time to show him exactly who he'd been talking down to. Let me back up. The Oakwood Country Club wasn't my kind of place. Too much marble, too many people in suits that cost more than I used to make in a month when I started at Boeing back in 1978. But my daughter Linda had insisted on throwing my retirement party there. "Dad deserves something nice for once," she'd said. I was standing near the back, trying to stay out of the way. At 67, I'd learned to make myself invisible in places like this. My shirt was clean, but it was from Sears, maybe 5 years old. My boots were comfortable steel-toed Red Wings, scuffed from years in the shop. My hair was gray, combed back, but nothing fancy. Linda moved through the crowd like she belonged. At 34, she'd learned to fit into Roger's world pretty well. Her dress was nice, her makeup perfect, and she had this way of laughing that made people warm up to her. She caught my eye across the room and gave me one of those real smiles that reminded me of when she was 8 and still thought her old man could fix anything. Roger was working the room like a politician. At 32, he'd built himself into exactly what he wanted to be. Successful marketing executive, MBA from Stanford, the kind of guy who got invited to the right parties. His suit probably cost more than my truck payment. His hair was perfect, and he had that confident smile that came from never doubting you belonged wherever you were. When Roger looked at me, the smile got polite but distant. Like you'd look at the guy who changes your oil. Necessary, but not somebody you'd actually talk to. It hadn't always been this way. 3 years ago, when Roger started dating Linda, he'd seemed different. Nicer. He'd ask me about cars, seemed genuinely interested when I talked about engines. But somewhere along the way, he'd decided I was just another blue-collar guy who didn't understand his sophisticated world. Here's the thing, I'd made a choice early on not to tell him about my real background. Harold Stevens, senior aerospace engineer, 46 years at Boeing, 15 patents in jet engine design. Instead, I became Harold the mechanic who ran a small garage. It wasn't technically a lie. I did work on cars, had been doing it as a hobby for 30 years, found peace in the hands-on work after spending decades with blueprints and computer models. When my wife Mary died 5 years ago, the garage work became therapy, something to keep my hands busy while my heart figured out how to keep going. But it wasn't the whole truth either. Roger seemed to need to feel superior, needed to feel like the smartest guy in the room. If he'd known I'd spent my career designing engines for military jets, if he'd known I held patents that were still being used in modern aircraft, it might have made him uncomfortable. So I let him explain business concepts to me over dinner. I asked polite questions about marketing strategies. I never mentioned Boeing, never brought up my Pentagon clearance or the classified projects I'd worked on. I loved him because Linda loved him. And I stayed quiet because it seemed kinder. The trouble started 3 weeks ago when Linda called about tonight's party. "Dad, Roger's been working so hard on this new account. All his colleagues are coming tonight, some really important people from his company. I was thinking maybe you could bring something, To show you appreciate what he does. I knew what she meant. Please try to fit in. Please don't embarrass us. I'd thought about it for days. What could I possibly bring that would mean something to Roger's crowd? I knew about aircraft engines and turbine design, not whatever impressed marketing executives. Then I remembered the carburetor. 18 months ago, I'd found it at an estate sale outside Tacoma. The seller didn't know what he had, just some old airplane parts from his grandfather's collection. Most people saw junk. I saw history. A Merlin engine. Carburetor from a P-51 Mustang, probably from World War II. I'd spent the next year and a half tracking down every component, machining replacement parts when I couldn't find originals, researching specs in maintenance manuals from the 1940s. It was delicate work, the kind of precision restoration that required understanding not just how the parts fit together, but why they were designed that way. When I finished, it was perfect. Museum quality. The Smithsonian had offered to buy it for their collection for $75,000. I'd turned them down. This wasn't about money. So when Linda asked me to bring something meaningful, I thought maybe this was it. Not because of the value. Roger would never accept something that expensive, but because it represented the best of what American engineering could accomplish. Precision, innovation, the kind of technical mastery that won wars. I should have known better. Roger saw me the minute I walked in carrying the protective case. He crossed the room with that professional smile. "Harold, glad you could make it." Not, "Thanks for coming," or "Good to see you," just acknowledgement that I'd shown up. "Brought you something," I said, holding out the case. Roger accepted it with the kind of polite enthusiasm you'd give a Christmas gift from a distant relative. He opened it and looked at the carburetor, clearly having no idea what he was looking at. "Airplane part," Roger said, like he was identifying a bug. "That's thoughtful." The way he said thoughtful made it clear he thought it was anything but. Behind him, I could see his colleagues drifting over. Young guys in expensive suits, a couple of women who looked like they'd stepped out of business magazines. They sensed entertainment coming. "Where'd you find this, Harold?" Roger asked, holding up the carburetor for his audience to see. "Estate sale up near Tacoma. Took me about 18 months to get it restored proper." Roger nodded like a teacher dealing with a slow student. "You have. To be careful with estate sales, Harold. Lot of reproduction stuff out there these days. People make fake antiques, sell them to folks who don't know better." The crowd chuckled appreciatively. Roger was in his element now, showing off his sophistication. "This looks like something you might find at a flea market," said one of Roger's friends, a thin guy with wire-rim glasses who looked like he'd never changed oil in his life. "Probably worth maybe $50 on eBay." More laughter. Roger was building momentum. "The thing is, Harold," Roger said, his voice taking on that patient tone you'd use with a child, "real aviation collectibles come with documentation, provenance papers, authentication certificates from museums or collectors' associations. They don't just turn up at garage sales." I could have stopped it right then. Could have pulled out the authentication documents I had in my jacket pocket. But something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity about how far he'd take this. Maybe it was the memory of 3 years of polite dismissal, of being treated like a well-meaning but simple man who couldn't possibly understand his sophisticated world. That's when Roger made his mistake. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the adrenaline of performing for his colleagues. Whatever the reason, he switched to French. "Mes amis," he said to his crowd, his voice dropping into smooth confidence. "This is exactly what I was telling you about. American blue-collar workers who think they understand quality." The words hit me like a wrench to the gut. Not because of the insult. I'd heard worse from better men during my years in aerospace, but because of the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that he could mock me to my face and I'd never know. Regardez-le, Roger continued, gesturing toward me like I was an exhibit. He actually thinks this piece of junk has value, probably paid $200 for it and convinced himself he found treasure. The crowd was eating it up. They didn't all speak French, but they could tell Roger was being clever at my expense. C'est pathétique, he went on. These old mechanics, they see some rusty metal with a few moving parts and think they've discovered the crown jewels. No understanding of real craftsmanship, real engineering. I stood very still, keeping my expression neutral, while Roger continued his performance. I'd learned French during a 2-year assignment at our Paris facility in the 1980s. We'd been working with French aerospace companies on joint projects, and I'd spent enough time there to become fluent. I'd negotiated contracts in French, presented technical specifications to French engineers. Roger didn't know any of that. To him, I was just Harold the mechanic, too stupid to understand that he was humiliating me in front of his professional network. Le problème, Roger said, warming to his theme, c'est que ces gens-là ne comprennent pas la différence entre de la vraie qualité et de la camelote. The problem is that these people don't understand the difference between real quality and junk. That's when Victor Coleman stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. I hadn't noticed him before. Distinguished-looking guy, probably early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested military background. Excuse me, Victor said to Roger, but could I take a closer look at that carburetor? Roger paused mid-sentence, his French commentary interrupted. He turned to Victor with a slightly annoyed expression. Of course, though I should warn you, it's almost certainly a reproduction. Victor took the carburetor carefully, handling it with the kind of attention I recognized immediately. This wasn't someone looking at a curiosity. This was someone who knew exactly what he was examining. Fascinating, Victor said after a long moment. This appears to be a Merlin engine carburetor, probably from a P-51 Mustang, based on the design characteristics. Roger's confidence faltered slightly. Well, yes, whoever made the reproduction obviously did their research. Victor looked up, and I saw disagreement in his eyes. Actually, this appears completely authentic to me. The metallurgy, the wear patterns, the way the components have aged. Modern reproductions simply can't replicate this kind of deterioration. The energy in the room shifted. Roger's neat performance was being challenged by someone who clearly had expertise. I'm sorry, Roger said, his executive instincts kicking in. Who are you exactly? Colonel Victor Coleman, U.S. Air Force, retired. I spent 30 years working with aircraft like this. I've handled quite a few historical pieces over the years. He gestured toward the carburetor. This is museum-quality restoration work. Whoever did this understands these engines at a level that takes decades to develop. I felt my heart skip. Colonel Coleman. I'd heard the name before, probably in military aircraft circles. Roger's face flushed. He was losing control of his audience, and he knew it. Colonel, I appreciate your input, but I work in the business world. I understand authentication and documentation. This piece simply doesn't have the proper paperwork to be considered genuine. What kind of paperwork would you expect? Victor asked, and something in his tone suggested he was testing Roger. Roger seized the opportunity to regain his authority. Provenance documentation from the source, authentication certificates from institutions like the Smithsonian or the Air Force Museum, valuation assessments from recognized auction houses, expert verification from aircraft restoration specialists. He ticked off each requirement like he was grading a failing student. He turned back to me, switching to English but keeping the condescending tone. Harold, when you bought this at that estate sale, did the seller provide any documentation at all? This was my moment. I could feel the weight of the folder in my jacket pocket. 18 months of authentication. Work, letters from the Smithsonian, verification from the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, Documentation that would make Roger look like a fool in front of his colleagues. But something made me hesitate. I looked at Roger's face, flushed with wine and certainty, convinced he was educating these people. I looked at Linda, standing at the edge of the crowd, with worry written all over her face. "Got some paperwork at home?" I said quietly. Roger's smile became genuinely pitying. "Harold, I'm sure you have some kind of certificate of authenticity, but you have to understand those are incredibly easy to fake. Real authentication requires institutional verification from multiple sources." He turned back to Colonel Coleman, professional to professional. "The problem with estate sales is that people find items they don't understand and build fantasies around them. They want to believe they've discovered something valuable, so they invest in fake documentation to support that belief." Colonel Coleman was studying my face now, not the carburetor. Something about my expression seemed to interest him. "What's the specific model designation on this carburetor?" he asked. Roger glanced at the piece. It appears to be some kind of aircraft carburetor from the World War II era." Colonel Coleman's eyebrows rose. "This is a Rolls-Royce Merlin Stromberg injection carburetor, specifically designed for the Packard 5-16507 engine used in P-51D Mustangs. The restoration work is absolutely extraordinary. Most people couldn't identify this component, let alone restore it to this condition." The room had gone completely quiet. "Harold," Colonel Coleman said, looking directly at me. "You didn't just clean this up, did you? You completely rebuilt it. The internal components, the float chamber, the mixture control. This is engineering-level restoration work." That's when I made my decision. I pulled out my wallet and extracted a business card I'd carried for 46 years. Slightly worn, but the Boeing logo was still clear. "Actually, Colonel," I said, handing him the card, "I spent my career working on the engines these carburetors fed." Colonel Coleman looked at the card, then up at me with sudden recognition. "Harold Stevens, Senior Aerospace Engineer, Propulsion Systems Division." He paused. "You're the Harold Stevens who holds the patents on the modern turbine fuel injection systems?" The room had gone dead silent. Roger was staring at the business card like it was written in hieroglyphics. "Guilty," I said simply. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folder I'd been carrying all evening. "Colonel, since you're interested, you might want to see these." I handed him the documentation. Letters from the Smithsonian on their official letterhead. Authentication from the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. Evaluation assessment from Heritage Auctions. 18 months of institutional verification from the exact sources Roger had demanded. Colonel Coleman studied the documents carefully, his expression growing more amazed with each page. "Harold, this is remarkable. Not just the carburetor, but the documentation. The Smithsonian offered you $75,000 for this piece?" "Turned them down," I said. "Some things aren't for sale." Linda had pushed through the crowd now, confusion and dawning realization on her face. "Dad? You never told me you worked for Boeing." "Worked there for 46 years, sweetheart. Started right out of college in 1978. Roger was staring at the papers, like they might burst into flames. "But you run a garage. I've seen your shop." "I work on cars because I enjoy it," I replied. "Keeps me connected to engines, to the practical side of what I spent my career designing. But that's not what I did for a living." Colonel Coleman was shaking his head in wonder. "Harold Stevens. I should have recognized the name immediately. You designed the fuel management systems for the F-16 program, didn't you? Among other projects." "My God," Colonel Coleman said to the crowd. "This man's work is still being used in modern military aircraft. His patents are fundamental to how jet engines operate today." Roger found his voice, though it came out strangled. "Why? Why would you hide this? Why let me think you were just a mechanic?" It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. Roger, when you married Linda, you were just starting your career. You needed to feel confident, needed to feel like you were the expert in the room. If you'd known I'd spent my life designing engines that power fighter jets, it might have made family dinners awkward. I looked around at the faces watching us. Sometimes being a good father-in-law means letting the younger generation feel like they're teaching you something, even when you already know it. But Roger wasn't letting it go. His embarrassment was turning into anger. So this was all a setup? You let me humiliate myself so you could have your big reveal moment? Roger, I said quietly, I never planned this. I brought that carburetor because I thought you might appreciate the craftsmanship, the engineering that went into it. You decided it was junk. You decided to mock it in front of your friends. I gestured to the crowd. And you decided to do it in French because you assumed I was too stupid to understand what you were saying. The accusation hung in the air. Roger's face went pale as he realized what I'd just revealed. You speak French? Fluently. Spent 2 years in Paris working with Airbus on joint projects in the 1980s. Roger's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ces gens-là ne comprennent pas la différence entre de la vraie qualité et de la camelote. I quoted back to him. These people don't understand the difference between real quality and junk. The color drained completely from Roger's face. Several people in the crowd looked uncomfortable, realizing they'd witnessed something ugly. Roger, I continued, my voice still calm. I understood every word you said. About me being pathetic, about blue-collar workers not understanding quality, about me being too stupid to know the difference between treasure and trash. Linda stepped between us. Dad, I had no idea. Roger, what did you say to him? Roger collapsed into a nearby chair. I called him a fool. I said he was pathetic. I made fun of him in French because I thought... He couldn't finish. Because you thought I couldn't understand, I completed for him. Because you assumed the old mechanic was too ignorant to know what you were really saying. The room was absolutely silent, except for the soft jazz playing in the background. Colonel Coleman stepped forward. Harold, I owe you an apology as well. I should have recognized your work immediately. Your contributions to aerospace engineering are legendary in military aviation circles. No apology necessary, Colonel. Most people outside the industry wouldn't know the names behind the technology. But Roger should have known who he was dealing with, Linda said, tears starting in her eyes. Dad, I'm so sorry. I had no idea he'd been treating you this way. Roger stood slowly, still holding the carburetor. Harold, I need to say something, and I need everyone here to witness it. The crowd leaned in. For 3 years, I've treated you with condescension and disrespect. I've explained things to you that you literally invented. I've made assumptions about your intelligence, your education, your worth, all based on how you dressed and what I thought your job was. His voice broke slightly. Tonight I stood here and called you pathetic in French because I assumed you were too uneducated to understand. I used you as entertainment for my colleagues. I took your gift and mocked it publicly. Several people in the crowd looked away, uncomfortable with his raw honesty. The worst part is that I did it because I needed to feel superior. I needed to feel like the smartest person in the room. And I made you pay the price for my insecurity. Roger looked down at the carburetor in his hands. You brought me a piece of history, something you spent 18 months restoring to perfection, something museums want to buy, and I called it junk. I stepped forward and put my hand on his shoulder. Roger, we all make mistakes when we're trying to prove ourselves. What matters is what we do next. I don't know how to fix this, he said. Start by treating people with respect, regardless of what job you think they do, I suggested. And maybe remember that there's usually more to someone's story than what you see on the surface. Linda hugged both of us. Dad, I want to know everything. About Boeing, about your patents, about the projects you worked on. I want to know who my father really is." "Well," I said, "it's a long story. Maybe we could start at dinner Sunday?" Colonel Coleman approached us again. "Harold, I have a proposition. The Air Force Museum has been looking for someone to consult on their restored aircraft display, someone who understands the engineering behind these machines. Would you be interested?" I looked at Roger, then at Linda. "As long as my family knows where I'll be on weekends." Roger managed a small smile. "Harold, I'd like to learn more about what you did at Boeing, if you'd be willing to tell me." "Son," I said, "I'd be honored to share it with you." That was 6 months ago. Now I'm standing in my garage watching Roger try to rebuild a carburetor from a 1967 Mustang. His technique is still uncertain, but his intention is pure. We've been having these Saturday sessions for months now, and the change in him is remarkable. "Remember," I tell him gently, "fuel systems are about precision. Every component has to work perfectly with every other component. There's no room for approximation." Roger nods, adjusting his approach. He still has his executive confidence, but it's tempered now with genuine curiosity and respect. The vintage P-51 carburetor is mounted in a place of honor on my workbench, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that expertise comes in many forms, that respect has to be earned both ways, and that family relationships require patience and understanding. "Harold," Roger says, pausing in his work, "Linda and I have some news." I look up from the manual I'd been reading. "We're expecting," he announces, his face lighting up with pride. I set down the manual carefully, feeling a grin spread across my face. "That's wonderful news, son." "We've been talking about names," Roger continues. "If it's a boy, we'd like to name him Harold, after his grandfather." I feel my throat tighten with emotion. I'd be honored. "And Linda wanted me to ask you something," Roger says, his voice turning serious. "She wants to know if you'd teach the baby about engines when he's old enough. Show him how things really work." I look around my garage. 46 years of collected tools, manuals, parts, and projects. All the knowledge I'd accumulated over a lifetime of building and fixing and improving. "Roger," I say, "there's nothing I'd like better than to pass it on to the next generation." He smiles and goes back to work on the carburetor. I watch him struggle with the float adjustment, remembering my own early days learning the craft. Everyone starts somewhere. Everyone deserves a chance to learn. The important thing is having someone patient enough to teach you, and humble enough to admit there's always more to learn. 6 months ago, Roger thought he knew everything about me based on my work clothes and calloused hands. He'd made assumptions about my intelligence, my education, my worth. But people aren't always what they seem. Sometimes the guy in the garage has spent 46 years designing the engines that power the world. Sometimes the person you're dismissing has more knowledge in his little finger than you've accumulated in your entire career. Sometimes the old man you're mocking in French actually speaks the language better than you do. The real gift isn't the carburetor worth $75,000, or the patents, or the recognition that finally came. The real gift is watching someone grow, watching them discover that the world is bigger and more complex than they thought, and being trusted to help them navigate it. I pick up my tools and move over to help Roger with the adjustment. There's work to do, and for the first time in years, I have someone to share it with. Someone who finally understands that respect isn't about what you do for a living. It's about how you treat the people around you. That's the lesson worth learning. Never assume you know someone's story based on their work clothes and calloused hands. The mechanic in the garage might just be the engineer who designed the systems that changed the world. Real wisdom isn't about proving you're the smartest person in the room. It's about having the patience to let others learn and the humility to keep learning. Yourself.